Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. This one is episode 139, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/139. I'm your host, Patrick McFarland, and today I am joined by Josh Harrison, who is an attorney, and very excited to have you on, Josh. Do you want to just introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. My name is Joshua Harrison. I'm a sole practitioner in Oklahoma City and primarily in the areas of family law, divorce, and do some criminal cases as well. But being a sole practitioner, kind of, if anybody calls my number, uh, I'm happy to take on anything I feel is in my skill level.
Awesome. Yeah, and what's your website for people who are kind
It's
of
joshuaharrisonlaw.com.
Okay. And I'll definitely put that in the show notes as well, but people should be able to find their way over to that if they want to check you out. But so we had met, or I had posted on a post that you made in the Tom Woods Show bloggers group. So I was kind of curious, like, what's your Liberty story?
Well, I was I went to Pepperdine University and majored in economics. And one of my professors who is most influential on me he blogs at the Mises Institute, and he never talked much about that, but his sort of anti-government and pro liberty views were apparent, especially in his public choice class, which I took in my senior year, I believe. And that's Dr. Gary Gallus is his name. And after that, I started into law school. I was still maybe what you might call a conservative at that point. Began listening to the Contra Krugman podcast, and as you may have experienced this, Patrick, as you start to meet people in law school, you realize what the people who are going to grasp at the kind of the wheels of government are like, and you start to kind of peel back the facade away from laws and see how they actually get made and um, how they're actually administered, and that started to change my opinion a lot with regards to a traditional conservative type of views and moving more into a libertarian or liberty focused. It's hard with labels, but more in the liberty movement.
Yeah, well, that's it's interesting. You said you started with Contra Krugman, because usually people find their way to Contra Krugman from Tom Woods Show.
Well, I had one of my classmates. We would talk about the kind of conventional neo-Keynesian synthesis, and it was through talking about that he had learned about Contra Krugman. And so I actually started on Contra Krugman and then started listening to Tom Woods' show separately from that.
Okay. Yeah, I still remember when I first started listening to Tom Woods. I was at my university and I was working in the alumni department doing like data entry and calling some alums and stuff like that. But it really was a lot of like data entry, so I just would put the podcast on for hours during the summer.
And that was my student job as well,
Was it really?
badgering alumni.
Yeah.
Um, and now I get calls from the person who was basically me, asking for money.
What do you tell them? Just out of curiosity.
I have that number saved in my phone, and I just don't answer.
Yeah. I always I make a point because I did this for undergrad too, but I make a point they usually call sometime in the fall. But I'll always give like $20 because I know that I will improve the stats of the person who's calling me. And so I'll give them an e-payment over the phone because I know that, they get rewarded based off that, but that's all I'm willing to do. And just as an aside, like I'm sure that the second time that you call, if it's someone who was given in the past, your asks go up? Did you have that?
I was not doing much of the fundraising. I was more kind of returning calls. So, and contacting people that had reached out to the university.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to, something that you had said earlier was you kind of see behind the veil a little bit when you're in law school and you see the types of your peers that go into certain industries. And I think one of the biggest revelations for me in law school was, I guess, understanding that there's no special class of person who goes into government work, and that it's usually like, you like to think of people as being professionals, and they are professionals and people work really hard, but at the same time they're fallible.
Yeah, you see the people that are having the same difficulties in classes that you are and are learning the same things. And if you're that kind of demystifies it for you. And I especially in my I had a class on legislative process, and the people in there that were very interested in that process kind of scared me a little bit.
Yeah. I'm sure, did you find is the same way that I did, that basically um there's a certain court historian role that law schools play, is they always, there's always one interpretation of the supremacy clause, for instance, and it all kind of skews in that direction. Was that your experience?
Yeah, it definitely the law schools love judicial interpretation and uh, the common law. I think Justice Scalia had commented on that the one of the problems with our legal education is a focus on common law, whereas most laws are statutory, and that we have jurists interpreting statutes, and whereas that kind of process makes a lot more sense in the common law that is built entirely on interpretation and analogy, when you apply that to statutory law, that's where things kind of take on a life of their own. You end up with judicial concepts that have grown and ballooned until they sort of eclipse the actual statutory law.
Yeah, and I think that, in one of the last episodes, Stefan Kinsella was kind of talking about this, how the common law, in correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but it seems like instead of the common law being a string of cases of precedent, it really turns into the judges trying to interpret what the statute says, and it's kind of like a bastardized version. Am I getting you?
Yeah, it's sort of a combination where we write down these statutes, and that's supposed to be the place where you go as a practitioner of the law, or even as just as someone who's working in business and trying to figure out what they're allowed to do. And but then that statement is not definitive, because we also have a series of precedents built upon it. And so you kind of end up with the worst of both worlds, in my opinion. Common law, it's just built on analogy and built up on an as needed basis. And it tends to not be as bogged down in the minutia as statutory law is. And then you also have the fact that it's variable and not as easy to reference, which is one of the strengths of statutory law. And you don't even get that strength with the current system that we have now. It's kind of, you don't really get any of the benefits from either of the systems. And the common law does exist to some extent, but it has been so heavily codified and adopted by state legislatures that you would assume, and I think most people do, that the laws are what's written down, and the judge's job is just to apply that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And so one thing I wanted to ask is I've looked at I've dabbled in looking at the laws of other states, and one thing that I've found is that the Wisconsin, if you look at any Wisconsin statutes, like the reviser of statute, the website is really user friendly and it's really nice to use. Does your state have the same thing? Because I looked at Texas once and it was just a cluster.
Well, the Oklahoma statutory references are pretty good on our OSCN is the kind of big repository of anything related to the Oklahoma courts. But the my preferred venue is justia.com for reviewing statutes. It has better links and allows you also to look at past statutes,
Oh, okay, yeah.
years of statutes.
Yeah, Wisconsin kind of has that too. I think, Lexis. Are you a Lexis or a Westlaw person?
Well, while I was in law school, I was a Westlaw person, and now I actually don't have um, a subscription to any of those services.
Yeah. Do you do so you had mentioned, do you do a lot of brief writing in your practice?
Almost none, fortunately.
Yeah.
It's very, very rare. The With family law, so much is on the issues of best interest of the child that there's not a lot constraining that or hemming in what the judge is going to look at. So with a nebulous concept like that, um, there's not much of a use for legal briefs, except in very edge cases. And then on the other side of the divorce practice, splitting up property is 50-50 of marital property, and you're not going to make much of a legal argument that you deserve more. And so that one has almost no grounds for uh, contesting things beyond spoliation or other kinds of damage to the marital estate.
I had a couple divorce cases. And so I had started out with a very small firm with just three lawyers. And so I did like general practice too. Some criminal stuff, some business stuff, some contracts, some property issues. So just kind of like a smattering of everything. But yeah, those two divorces, I didn't get very far either before I left the firm. But
Oh, yeah.
do you primarily represent husbands or wives, or is it
I don't really have a primary clientele as far as which side. I've represented both sides. I know there's a national family law firm that fans of sports radio will be familiar with, but that advertise themselves as targeting male clients. But for the most part, there's not really that kind of specialization there.
I think the reason I ask is because I had a buddy from law school who practiced in the Twin Cities, and it seemed like his practice was mostly like the firm he worked for was mostly geared toward being a father's firm. I don't know if it was that specific firm, but I thought it was always interesting because he's kind of a Bernieite, I would say, and
Hmm.
he was not a men's rights type in family law. So have you had any just any observations about your family law practice? Just faults in the system or critiques you could make or things you see happening?
Well, I think as maybe a general critique of the legal system is the pace is so slow compared to what the parties actually would like. Most states have a mandatory minimum waiting period when you file for divorce up to 90 days. And that's disappointing to a lot of people that want to have a divorce done quickly. I don't deal with uncontested divorces very often, but I have a case right now that's a 2018 case number, uh, and they're still not divorced. Hopefully soon, but they can take a long time and be very aggravating for the parties, and it makes it very difficult for them to manage their finances when there's certain things that they're forbidden from doing.
Yeah, and it's same thing with personal injury practice. A lot of it is kind of built into it, but I say, if I have a client whose case we're finally filing, I'd say, plan. You don't like to give times because then they get their
Yeah.
head on a certain time, and I understand why, certainly, but I'd say, at least a year, depending on, how far things go and if people cooperate. But yeah, it really is the slow churn of justice.
And attorneys and judges are very unsympathetic to that kind of complaint. There does get to be a certain point where judges will refuse to delay things and will push for going to trial, and that eventually does come, but it's much slower than what clients really want. There's tactics to delay, and you can use them a lot longer than people would imagine that you could.
Yeah, certainly. I was researching. We had an issue where the other side's clients weren't responding to discovery, and they weren't cooperating with their attorneys, and we were looking at ending the case. And in some case law, I saw cases where attorneys didn't respond to discovery requests for 3 years, and then the court takes it upon their own motion to dismiss the case. Um, so just it's crazy, but like at least in the personal injury side, there's the 3-year statute of limitations, but you try to make sure that your client is as healed as they're going to get, and so that builds in a whole segment of time even before you file. So sometimes you're filing in the third year, that statute of limitations. So the case could actually last 2 or 3 more years, just depending on that. So it's a long time.
Yes, I've done one workers' compensation case, and those, because they are also broken out into their own system. I think in every state that's the case. Um, that system can take things even longer, and there's not as much of a final resolution, um, because those cases can be reopened.
Yeah, that's a different animal, and I think as a rule, I don't know if it seems to me like you can only really make a living doing workers' comp if you churn volume, and it's that kind of thing. Maybe it's different in your state.
No, it's not different. I had the pleasure of practicing under the old law that was changed in, I believe it was 2013. I've heard horror stories about the new law and the restrictions on recovery that have been put. Um, I heard of a guy that lost his leg, and he got $7,000 from his workers' comp because of the minimal amount of hours he worked at that job. So there's uh, there's a lot of problems with that system that I will never be getting involved with again if I can avoid it.
Is that a government created system, or what's
Yeah, that's one of those, and this system, these kind of administrative law systems pop up where there's an established industry that wants to move out of the courts, mostly because they want to get away from juries. The reason for where workers' comp is now is that juries were just slamming companies with $1 million or multi-million dollar judgments for serious injuries. And so, in order to kind of limit their liability, about a century ago, I believe is when it started, they started moving these. Like it would be millions of dollars in today's money, but they started moving into these workers' comp administrative law systems where the procedure is much different. There's no juries, and everything's decided by um, administrative law judges. And the new system doesn't even use administrative law judges; it uses commissioners, which are appointed and may not have the same legal experience.
And kind of likewise with the personal injury system, I'm sure that you learned a bit about tort reform happening, I think, in the 80s and 90s. And there's the infamous McDonald's hot coffee case, which, being a conservative more so, I thought that was bunk too until I went to law school and actually we analyzed the case and saw horrific burns that like led to her death.
Yeah, that case, that was one that, yeah, definitely hit the public perception very differently than how the actual facts were on the ground. I mean, when you think hot coffee, you imagine, how hot could it possibly be?
Right.
Um, and I have not seen those images, but heard descriptions of the long term damage that woman had. Um, but the public perception that there's too much uh, personal injury litigation in America has, I don't know who's peddling that story, but it seems to only benefit certain kinds of people.
Yeah, and I guess the connection I was trying to make too with that is, so for workers' comp cases, my understanding is that it's not that the company is negligent; it's just that they had an employee who was injured on the job. Is that right?
There's a Yeah, it's kind of a minimal amount of fault. It has to be caused by the conditions of their um, place of employment. It can't just be someone else's doing. It's not an area I know too much about. The issue of fault had already been settled in the case that I got into. Um, but my understanding is that it's a pretty low burden to prove that it's the subject of workers' comp when there's an injury.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking about the case that we had where this our client was electrocuted, and she's had problems, going on for years. And of course, this is like 4 years post accident, post incident, I should say, and they're still kind of talking about, well, it's not possible that this piece of machine could have shocked her because we sent our experts in, and there's not a, it's been remedied by now, or you know what I mean. So it's just it's interesting. But so how has COVID affected your practice?
Well, the courts were closed for about 2 months. The I had just as this was kind of starting before things had shut down, I had just done a bench trial in a case, and that was the last trial that I've had this year. Um, in the sense that you would normally think of a trial, sometimes things are called a trial that don't really fit into that box well. But um, jury terms have started back up again. Um, the believe that was about a month ago that jury terms started back, and it slowed a lot of cases down, basically put a halt on certain things, and the courts were already behind and packed before. It's I don't know if they'll ever recover from this kind of broad-based delay to every type of case. There have been some improvements of doing more things over email, and the court staff seem to like that, and are wanting to uh, keep doing certain types of motion practice just over email. And I was recently in a more rural county, and the judge was video conferencing into the courtroom that I was in from the same building, but he was just video conferencing in, and those of us in the courtroom had our masks on. The judge in his chambers, coming through on video, didn't, and that was certainly a unique kind of experience doing things that way. But that seems to be working, and people are adapting well. I think the family law doesn't involve jury trials. I imagine the areas that have lots of jury trials are the most affected. And, I don't envy the task of trying to catch up.
Yeah. I think it is pretty damning, this thought of, yeah, I don't know if the courts will ever recover because they were already behind. And I mean, for us in PI work, the specter of a jury trial is kind of like the hammer that we can carry that will force things along. Because ultimately we're responsible for pushing the case forward. And we don't have that really. I mean, you get jury trials kind of on the schedule, but so it's interesting. You said they started the jury terms a month ago.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, maybe more than that. I would have to look at my
Oh,
schedule. I remember what I was in court for whenever it was that day that they were starting the jury term up again.
okay.
And
And
the most people I had seen at the courtroom in many months.
and I just, because in Wisconsin, like they had postponed it in like March last year, and then they had, I don't know, the Supreme Court allowed or circuit courts to be coming up with their own contingency plan to resume jury trials, and they said, well, we can change the plan whenever we want, and we can also call them off again whenever we want. But apply to us, and we might approve you to resume jury trials. So I heard of a few of them going off, but then all of a sudden there was another order a couple weeks ago just suspending them indefinitely again.
Yeah, I think basically every district judge in Oklahoma County did a jury term. Um, and I don't know if they've done one since, but there's still there's been a lot of slowdown with criminal cases. Is my exposure to that element, even though a very small percent ever go to trial. The same with private injury. We have that is the kind of specter that haunts the case, and when that's not there, it becomes hard to get people motivated. Nobody wants to plead to going in custody and going to prison whenever they know that they're not going to be able to have a trial to send them to prison. And the caseloads of already overladen district attorneys is makes that job even more unpleasant than it normally is.
I'm sure. So is it that DAs are giving out more plea deals? Are they being a bit more lenient?
No, they would never do
Wishful
that.
thinking. Wishful.
um, my experience with district attorneys is they're all true believers,
Yeah.
and that there's often, I don't know if this is a more common on the left to believe that people are shills or in some way motivated by career prospects solely or by financial gain. But what I always try to tell people is they're very sincere, and you can't not believe in what you're doing and do a job that is so laborious. So I don't think they've been giving out any better of deals recently. Um, they have been more comfortable with letting cases move along kind of slowly, which all my clients are uh, out of custody whenever their case is going on. And so that's great for my clients. It's not great for clients at the public defender's office who are in jail awaiting trial.
Yeah, that was my next question, was if you had any clients who are just kind of sitting awaiting. I suppose at some time they can just be like, okay, well, you've been in there for 300 days, time served, that kind of.
Yeah, I haven't had any credit for time served cases that have um, just kind of gone away because of that. I have had clients that have had a tough time getting transferred to prison in a timely fashion from jail. Fortunately, I think they're able to earn credit on their sentence a little faster when they're in county jail.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Forgot about that aspect of it.
How the Department of Corrections factors time is kind of mysterious, and they don't let too much be known about that. There are limitations on how much extra time you can get depending upon what crime you've been accused of, but uh, I, I just at some point they tell you you're done.
Yeah.
And they do sort of know in advance what they're on pace to do. Um, if there's been good behavior or there are other methods of uh, earning credit for more time.
I couldn't remember if that was in Minnesota or Wisconsin, in my limited criminal practice where they would give you credit for good time. It was like for every 3 days, you get 1 day, something like that.
Yeah, they do things like that. If you take classes, or I know that if you get like your GED or something, you just get a big box of days added on, when you graduate, and there's a lot of things like that that can get people some more time. Yeah, people often think that um, your sentence is how long. If someone's sentenced to 5 years, that's how long they're going to be there. Well, not even close. Uh, Sometimes, if there's good behavior um, and a Department of Corrections that's kind of free with the time.
One thing that I keyed in on is the DA's office and having true believers in there. It really seems like, I mean, I think I've done shows on this in the past with, like, I talked to Kyle Anzalone, just for the audience. I talked to Kyle Anzalone on some like FBI entrapment schemes, and I really did a deep dive into like retribution and different theories of punishment. But it seems like the more classical approach is to tailor, because the general theme is that, back in the 1700s, the classical approach is to tailor the punishment to the offender and to the crime. But it seems like as you've gotten more into the progressive era and things have advanced more forwards, it really has come into this analytical type of formulaic, um, kind of technocratic kind of theory of punishment. And it seems like I've seen this in the DA's office where they will have these, well, first off, with the bail bond score, they'll evaluate everyone. They did this in Minnesota, where they give certain points in a formula based on, how many times you've been in for the last year, um, how closely you live to the, ties to the community, and they put it in a formula and it spits out an answer, and that kind of affects the bail argument. But in the county, I was doing one criminal case, and it was some really low level. It was like a city ordinance violation on a marijuana possession, and it was his second offense. And the DA's office had this policy that they wouldn't do diversion on a second offense, and they wouldn't do community service on a second offense just to make it dismiss and go away. And those policies are so blind to, the individual offender. And my guy was, he was a college student. He was in his third year, about to graduate. Yeah, he smoked pot. Who cares? Kind of thing. And they just, as a term of policy, I even I talked to the head DA, the elected one in the county, and he was like, "Yeah, we don't do community service because the studies show that it doesn't do anything." But have you come across that at all? Sorry for going on a bit.
No, that's an interesting experience and an interesting policy. Um, I haven't encountered uh, situations where I've been told it's our policy that we don't do X, Y, or Z. Now maybe they um, just say no and don't try and justify it by saying it's above their pay grade. But there are certain things that are statutorily ineligible from different kinds of diversion programs. I mean, like trafficking, for instance, is ineligible from going to drug court, and so there are those policies that are enacted in statute that certain types of offenses aren't eligible for community sentencing or um, alternative court.
Is that like mandatory minimums too? You've come across that, I'm sure.
Yes. So in Oklahoma, we do have something that's kind of called, perhaps just informally, a judicial escape valve, and where a judge, we don't really have any true mandatory minimums. So a judge is allowed to. I have seen once a someone get a fine of $250 for their multiple possessions of marijuana. This was back when we still had marijuana felonies in Oklahoma. We no longer have those, but the the judge can kind of use that to go below that, though they tend to stick in the ranges of the things that get brought to them.
Have you one thing that I noticed when I was doing some criminal work is that I went in, I'm still an idealist, but how have your views changed? I mean, it seems like so if you were more of a conservative in law school, were you ever really an idealist in the sense that, no victimless crimes? I still believe that, but how did your views change at all when you entered the practice and you became maybe more pragmatic, perhaps?
I think even when I still considered myself a conservative, I didn't believe in prosecuting low-level drug offenses, or what you could either call the possession or retail sale of drugs. I think it took, but one of the issues with the higher tiered trafficking is that it's often charged based solely on the amount of drugs that are found, and it's all over the place, the different amounts for different drugs, and some of them are have habitual user levels of drugs, and then they get charged with trafficking. That word carries certain connotations to people, and also one tricky thing is that all the weights are in metric units, which juries are not familiar with, and so when they say it's a couple milligrams of something, people don't know how much that is.
Yeah. So, in my own experience, it was kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, I want to feel like in this county, the drug cases that I'm getting, I want to feel like let's not prosecute victimless crimes. And I still believe that, but at the same time, it was never so clear cut that it was always just a possession. It was always possession with a theft or possession with a battery or something like that. And it was that was one thing that really kind of muddied the water for me. So like, do you ever see just a pure victimless crime, one count kind of thing?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, I have seen that. The worst charge I've ever seen a person that offended me the most that I saw someone charged with. It was actually two counts. The first the first count was um, possession of a firearm while in commission of a felony, and the felony was felon in possession of a firearm.
Yeah.
So he was charged with having a gun while having a gun, and but I have seen, straight drug charges. I think that one of the reasons that district attorneys kind of like the drug charges is they're a lot easier to prove than something that doesn't have a mens rea, doesn't have a intent component to it. They have to prove that you knew you had it, but a jury's all going to believe that you knew you had very valuable drugs in your pocket. So that's pretty easy to establish. And so I think that's part of the reason that drug charges have become so ubiquitous and are used so, because they're much more reliable than other types of charges.
Do you kind of see that the is the police force in your area, are they overburdened with drug crimes?
Um, I don't know too much about their constraints or anything. Um, I know that there do seem to be enough drug cases that they must be making a priority of it. Um, we do have, marijuana's always possession's always a misdemeanor now, and so they've kind of backed off of that. Um, but down here is meth country, and so there is often that element is pursued uh, pretty heavily.
So what's your favorite part about being a lawyer?
My favorite part is that it's allowed me to have my own practice and kind of uh, have the freedom that comes with being my own boss. As well, it's just an exciting job. There's a lot of crazy things that you get to tell your friends that about this crazy thing that happened, and that is really the in terms of job satisfaction. It's when there's a crazy thing that happened or you get a good result and you really feel like you've helped out somebody. That's what keeps me wanting to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. I The stories is probably one of my favorites too. And I will say though that it seems like when at least when you get together with some old attorneys, it seems like all they do is tell war stories. And
Yes, I don't actually spend a lot of time with other attorneys, um, and the but that is something that definitely people always want to tell you their war stories.
yeah. I do enjoy the war stories though, I will say. But I tried to explain to my wife I had so last week I had depositions like 3 days in a row in three different cases. And so I had to prepare all those clients and then do the depots and everything. But it was like I tried to explain to my wife what it was like. I had like a 7 hour deposition and we went straight through lunch. And I was like, honey, it was like skydiving for 7 hours. That's how it felt. So
Yeah, there is that rush when things are on the line, and the next words you say can separate your case from disaster or victory, and there's not a lot of jobs that I think have that kind of stakes. If you say something wrong in a meeting, you can correct yourself and go back. But certain times, if you say the wrong thing to a judge, or if you frame an issue in the way that the opposing counsel has been trying to frame it, just by virtue of repeating their wording, uh, that can be a disaster. And sometimes you get a great turn of phrase, or you get something great out of an opposing witness, and that is, that's a really thrilling part of the job. I'm in the courtroom a lot, and so that's really the part of the job that I enjoy.
Yeah. I'm learning to like the rush. I was never much of a person who I wouldn't say that I thrive too much on situations like that. Maybe I did. I don't know. It's an interesting profession. It certainly is. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, the the trial bug kind of gets people early. I mean, I was doing my internship and watching my supervisors do trials, and then I had the opportunity to do a first degree murder trial, and when I was in law school, and did that, and I was pretty much, after I had done my cross examinations, I was like, okay, like this is what I'm trying to. This is the rush that I was looking for in this job. My other career path that didn't get followed was looking for a master's in economics, and I just thought that it would be so much more exciting to go to law school, and I'm always glad that it turns out that I was right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you could always get a master in economics. I mean, with things going, but yeah. Well, it seems like I don't know who was crap. Can't believe I can't think of his name, but he wrote like To Protect and Serve and Economics and the Law. He had why can't I think of him? Anyways, you could go that route maybe.
Well, my family has always been pretty big into higher education. Both of my parents have PhDs, um, and so I joked with them after I got my JD that I was the imbecile in the family because because I didn't have a real doctoral degree. But the the job of a lawyer, despite um, the way that it's framed, is really more like a mechanic or a doctor or a plumber in a lot of ways. You're dealing with a system that has very particular constraints on it, and you're trying to solve this practical problem that your clients have by using this system that can be really arcane or confusing and has lots of twists and turns.
What's the you mentioned that you practice with a lot of pro se litigants, and I feel like I learned at some point in time doing this show and interacting with the liberty community that you'll always maybe run into a posse comitatus type person, or someone who wants to represent themselves or thinks the whole thing is bunk, which, hey, um I can understand at times.
Yeah.
But what is the biggest mistake you think that pro se litigants make?
I think that uh, sometimes pro se litigants have this sort of denial that a lot of people have, where they think that things are just going to kind of go away or get resolved. And I do see a lot of pro se litigants that aren't doing the things they need to do, aren't responding to things, but unfortunately, they get away with it most of the time. Judges are very, um, give lots of chances, and and sometimes the judge kind of becomes their lawyer in a way. But when someone's a pro se litigant, they usually don't have a good sense of what's a likely outcome in their case, and because of that, they can really stick and want to be pushing towards trial, not settle, because they are too caught up in their own view of what should happen, that they don't have any experience to tell them, what's a likely outcome.
Yeah, I was going to add on my end that my experience with pro se litigants is that they have this inability to view their case objectively. Um,
Yeah, I fall in. I can't view my cases objectively most of the time. I am as susceptible as many are to kind of buying into my own spin, and you have to be confident to your client, and sometimes you end up getting caught along with that. But occasionally there are moments of clarity where you realize, while you're sitting in bed getting ready to go to sleep,
yeah.
that okay, this case is not as strong as I hyped myself up to today. And usually when there's an attorney on the other side, it's easier to kind of combine both of your experience and aim towards a settlement that's realistic. And the thing that I always counsel my clients is that the judge is a blunt instrument, and they're not going to tinker and customize your settlement in the same way that we can in an agreement. And so, especially when kids are involved and visitation, you don't want a judgment that's not going to factor in your particular needs, and a judge is not always going to feel inclined to do that.
Yeah, and I've used that with my clients too, in terms of well, that's something I've noticed with my clients too, like pro se litigants, it's hard for them to view the case objectively, and sometimes you got to bring them down to earth a little bit. But I always like it when there's an attorney on the other side, because I can say, well, I like this because it makes they can talk to their clients too and talk some sense into their clients. Um, but for a settlement, but then again, sometimes attorneys can be not very cooperative, and so maybe they push a bit higher. That happens a lot too, or
Yeah.
lower.
Yes, some attorneys treat it like it's their own case, and they want to resolve it for their own reasons. And when you're on the opposite side of that, it's kind of obvious, or they feel like they're itching for a fight, and that they think they can get this big win out of the case. No one really wins in a family law case. Everybody loses, and but sometimes they think they can get the important things that they want done. Um, yeah, sometimes they're right, but that's not usually the judge is going to make everyone equally unhappy.
Yeah, it's kind of depressing a little bit, but you know, you I think though that like you said before, the good part about it is that one of the best parts about this profession is that you can help people. You're helping these people through the worst time in their life, basically, and there's a lot of reward in that.
Yeah, clients are often very scared about what can happen, especially in criminal cases. There's a lot at stake there, and it's kind of this system that's aiming at them, and they're just one person, or they have their family support network. They don't feel that they um, have any chance against this kind of monolithic entity that's bearing down on them, and you kind of have to walk them back and say, okay, there's a process, and it's not going to be great, but we can uh, get you through this and find a resolution that's going to be better than just barreling through and going to trial and getting uh, those big maximum numbers or something on there.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's a good note as any, I think, to end it on. But I think, do you have any other pet issues? I mean, I poke around in the law, and there's a lot of topics I cover on the show that we could do a show about later on, maybe.
Yeah, I'm working on a post from the blog section of my website on mass incarceration or over incarceration. If if the reason we had a lot of people in jail was because we had lots of murderers and rapists running around that we needed to lock up, mass incarceration wouldn't be a problem. It would be a solution, but that's not the case that we have, and there's a lot of subtle issues that don't get talked about in there. So I'm working on that topic and trying to educate people on the other factors outside of the ones people normally talk about that lead to mass incarceration.
Yeah, and so we'll have to talk about that when you get that. But I really like your website. It looks really nice, and so everyone should check that out.
Yeah, well, it helps to hire a professional to,
Well,
to do it for you.
it certainly looks very professional.
And
So
when it's a business expense, it's great. So,
yeah, just an added bonus.
hmm.
All right. Well, Josh, do you prefer Josh or Joshua? I
Josh
suppose.
is great.
Okay. All right. I'm asking at the end of the interview. So, but yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm glad that we ran into each other, and I've been looking to get more legal minds on the show, and then, we'll just continue forward with it.
Yeah, it's great to hear from a lawyer that has the same kind of skepticisms of the system that I'm sure you see that most of our colleagues um, are just fully on board with um, not every minute detail, but they're on board with the larger project.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly. Yeah. There's a I liken this with the medical profession too, is that when you go to law school, it's a professional school, but there's a certain institutional academic bias that they try and put you in that direction. And most people, they don't have preformed opinions like us. So I think they just take it and they go.
I think that's definitely true, and the state of the American Bar Association is a testament to that.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, just for everyone, I'll put it in the show notes, but what's your website again?
It's joshuaharrisonlaw.com.
Okay. Sounds great. Okay, well, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch everybody next time.
All right, thanks for having me.